In the manicured silence of Pinecrest Estates golf course, a soft-spoken newcomer in plain khakis was about to ruin Karen Whitfield's Saturday morning. What started as a casual round on the 10th tee spiraled when Karen, self-appointed guardian of community standards, stopped her game to confront the unfamiliar black man for trespassing. Marcus Johnson wasn't your typical club guest. For 2 decades, he'd navigated elite spaces as a nationally ranked golf champion, known for his lethal swing, calm demeanor, and a quiet knack for exposing hypocrisy without ever raising his voice. When Karen called security, filmed him for documentation, and questioned his right to even stand on the grass, she had no idea she was messing with Pinecrest's newest VIP resident and soon-to-be face of their elite club. Marcus's measured response, pulling out his own phone and calmly inviting verification, set off a viral chain of accountability Pinecrest had never seen. What began as a petty power trip would become a national reckoning. The Pinecrest HOA would never forget the day Karen Whitfield went viral for trying to enforce rules she didn't understand, on a man she couldn't control. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun gleamed off the pristine fairways of Pinecrest Estates, casting long shadows across manicured lawns that surrounded colonial-style homes with perfect symmetry. From a distance, the community appeared as a watercolor painting of suburban affluence, flawless, serene, and utterly controlled. Inside the cedar-paneled clubhouse conference room, Karen Whitfield's French manicured nail tapped rhythmically against her leather portfolio. The monthly Homeowners Association meeting had reached its most important segment: violations and community standards. "The Hendersons on Magnolia Court," Karen said, sliding a photo across the polished mahogany table. "Their grass exceeded our 4-inch height regulation for the 3rd time this quarter." Her voice carried the practiced concern of someone who believed she was performing a civic duty. "I've drafted a formal warning with a 7-day compliance notice." Richard Pearson, the HOA president, nodded with professional deference. At 62, with silver hair and a perpetual country club tan, he had perfected the art of appearing engaged while mentally calculating his afternoon tea time. "Thank you, Karen. Your vigilance is, as always, appreciated," he said, not meeting the eyes of several board members who exchanged subtle glances. "Let's put the Henderson matter to a vote. All in favor?" 7 hands rose dutifully. Only Amara Washington hesitated before raising hers halfway. "Moving on," Richard continued. "The Patels have again submitted their request to paint their front door. The color is—" He squinted at the paper. "Vermilion sunset." Karen straightened in her chair. "That's still red, Richard. We've been through this. Acceptable exterior colors are listed in Section 8.3 of our covenant: neutrals, sage green, or colonial blue. Red doors attract attention and disrupt the aesthetic harmony we've worked so hard to maintain." "My door is blue," offered Diane Calloway, Karen's closest ally on the board. "Williamsburg blue, it's classic." "Exactly," Karen nodded. "Standards exist for a reason." From the other end of the table, Amara Washington cleared her throat. At 41, she was one of the younger board members and one of only 3 black homeowners who had been elected to the HOA in Pinecrest's 30-year history. "Perhaps we could revisit some of these aesthetic guidelines," she suggested, her tone measured. "Many communities are adopting more flexible standards that allow for cultural expression while maintaining property values." Karen's smile tightened. "Pinecrest has maintained the highest property values in North Atlanta, precisely because we don't bend to trends, Amara." Her emphasis on the name carried a subtle note of condescension. "Our wait list of potential buyers suggests our approach works." Richard glanced at his watch. "Let's table the Patel request for further review. I do have some exciting news to share." He brightened, sitting taller. "After extensive recruitment, we've successfully hired Marcus Johnson as our new golf pro and VIP instructor." The room stirred with interest, all except Karen, who continued reviewing her notes. "Johnson was NCAA champion at Stanford and has placed in several PGA tournaments," Richard continued, his voice carrying genuine enthusiasm. Having him choose Pinecrest over several other clubs is quite a coup. He'll be moving into the new construction on Oak Hollow next week. Oak Hollow? Karen looked up sharply. I thought those homes were still under pre-approval review. Richard cleared his throat. The club expedited matters to secure his acceptance. How nice that some people get to bypass the procedures the rest of us follow, Karen muttered, just loudly enough to be heard. Amara redirected the conversation. While we're discussing community matters, I'd like to propose expanding our cultural events calendar. The Diversity Committee has drafted suggestions for events that might appeal to our increasingly varied membership. Karen closed her portfolio with a definitive snap. Our events committee already has the summer schedule finalized, Amara. The Memorial Day Barbecue, July 4th Parade, and Labor Day Gala have been Pinecrest traditions for decades. And they're wonderful traditions, Amara acknowledged. We're simply suggesting additions, not replacements. Events that might make newer residents feel more welcome and included. Everyone is welcome at our existing events, Diane interjected. That's what makes Pinecrest special. We all participate in the same traditions. That's what builds community. Richard, sensing the familiar tension building, intervened. Let's have the Diversity Committee submit a formal proposal for the fall schedule. Now, if there's no further business, 40 minutes later, Karen and Diane settled into their regular table at the clubhouse restaurant, overlooking the first tee where a foursome of men in pastel polo shirts laughed as they prepared to start their round. Did you see Amara's proposal? Karen asked, meticulously spreading her napkin across her lap. Diwali celebrations and Juneteenth commemorations? This isn't some international food festival. It's Pinecrest. Diane nodded sympathetically. I know you're just trying to maintain the standards that brought us all here in the first place. Exactly, Karen said, warming to her favorite subject. Richard doesn't see it, but every exception weakens the whole. First, it's a red door. Then it's flags and banners and lawn decorations. Before you know it, we're just another neighborhood where anything goes. And the property values reflect it, Diane added, right on cue. Karen lowered her voice. Between us, I'm concerned about who's buying in now that they've opened those new sections. People who haven't grown up with certain standards. The Patels are lovely people, but they simply don't understand our aesthetic. And now this golf pro moving in without proper review. What does that tell you about priorities? Diane took a sip of her iced tea. Times are changing, I suppose. They may be changing elsewhere, Karen replied firmly, but Pinecrest has values worth preserving. Near the clubhouse entrance, Trevor Williams straightened his security uniform as he watched members arrive for lunch and afternoon tea times. At 28, he represented the third security service Pinecrest had employed in 5 years. The previous 2 had been dismissed for being either too lenient or too strict, depending on whose property had been subjected to their enforcement. Good afternoon, Mr. Whitfield, Trevor said, holding the door as an older gentleman approached. The man breezed past without acknowledgement, a common occurrence that Trevor had learned not to take personally. His job was simple in theory: enforce the rules equally for everyone. In practice, he understood the unwritten hierarchy. Members received deference. Members' guests received polite scrutiny. Vendors and service workers received careful monitoring. And anyone who couldn't be immediately categorized was approached with professional suspicion. Excuse me, sir, Trevor called to a landscaper whose truck had parked slightly over the designated service line. You'll need to adjust your vehicle. The worker nodded wearily and returned to his truck while Trevor recorded the interaction in his daily log. Rules were rules, after all, even if they seemed to bend for some and remain rigid for others. As the HOA meeting adjourned, members filed out of the clubhouse into the warm Georgia afternoon. Karen paused at the top of the steps, her attention caught by an unfamiliar sedan, dark blue with out-of-state plates, parked in the members section. Is that car registered? She asked Trevor, who was stationed nearby. I believe it belongs to a guest of the club, ma'am, he replied. All visitors signed in properly today. Karen studied the vehicle, committing the plate number to memory. We're getting more and more unfamiliar faces lately, she remarked. It pays to stay vigilant. As she walked to her own Lexus, perfectly parked within the space lines, Karen didn't notice Richard escorting a tall, athletic black man from the clubhouse to that very sedan. The two men shook hands warmly, laughing at some shared joke before the visitor climbed into the blue car. Karen was already planning tomorrow's rounds of the neighborhood, her self-appointed patrol to ensure Pinecrest remained exactly as it had always been, pristine, predictable, and protected from change at all costs. Saturday mornings at Pinecrest were sacred. The dew still clung to the perfectly trimmed Bermuda grass as members trickled onto the course, their voices carrying across the fairways in the crisp morning air. Karen Whitfield considered these early weekend hours the community at its finest, an orderly procession of familiar faces in pastel polos and crisp visors, all adhering to unwritten but universally understood protocols of pace and etiquette. She had just finished the 7th hole, slightly ahead of schedule, when she noticed him. A man she didn't recognize stood at the edge of the 10th tee, studying the fairway with focused intensity. He wore plain khaki shorts and a simple black polo, no designer logos, no club insignia, and carried a weathered leather golf bag rather than the latest carbon fiber model favored by most members. What caught Karen's attention most, however, was that he was black, and she was certain she knew every black member of Pinecrest. There weren't many to keep track of. Karen paused, watching from behind her oversized sunglasses. The stranger took a practice swing, his form undeniably professional. He then stepped up to the ball and drove it with such fluid precision that it sailed in a perfect arc toward the distant green. Instead of continuing to the 8th hole, Karen discreetly pulled out her phone and began taking photos. She zoomed in on his face, then his attire, then his bag. Something wasn't right. Membership at Pinecrest cost $75,000 just to join, with annual dues that exceeded what many Americans earned in months. People who belonged here looked the part. She approached along the cart path, arranging her features into what she considered her authoritative expression, pleasant but firm. "Excuse me," she called, her voice carrying across the manicured grass. "Are you a member here?" The man turned, his expression neutral as he assessed her. Up close, Karen noticed his athletic build and the confidence in his posture. "Good. Morning," he replied with a polite nod. "I'm Marcus Johnson." "I didn't ask your name," Karen said, her smile tightening. "I asked if you're a member." "I'm the new golf pro," Marcus explained calmly. "And yes, I am also a resident. I moved into Oak Hollow last week." Karen's eyes narrowed. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. And, regardless, protocol was protocol. "Our professionals wear Pinecrest attire when on the course," she stated, "and residents need to display their membership tags." She gestured to the small green tag hanging from her own golf bag. "I understand." Marcus nodded. "My official start date is Monday and my membership materials are still being processed. Richard Pearson can confirm everything." "Richard isn't here now, is he?" Karen's voice took on an edge. "And I've never seen you before. Members can't just wander onto the course without proper identification. It's a security issue." Marcus maintained his composure, though a muscle in his jaw tightened. "I appreciate your concern for the club's rules. If you'd like to call Richard, I'm happy to wait while you verify my position." Karen's certainty wavered for just a moment, but only a moment. She'd served on the board for 8 years. She knew every employee, every protocol. "I think I'll call security instead," she said, pulling out her phone again. "If you are who you claim to be, they can sort it out." As she dialed, Karen switched her phone to video mode and positioned it to capture Marcus in the frame. "I'm recording this for documentation purposes," she announced. "This is Karen Whitfield, HOA board member. I'm on the 10th tee with an unidentified individual claiming to be staff, but who cannot produce credentials." Marcus's expression remained controlled, but his eyes hardened. He pulled out his own phone. "Two can play at this game," he said quietly, starting his own recording. "For my protection." By now, a nearby foursome had slowed their play, watching the interaction with undisguised interest. Among them, George Hathaway, a silver-haired executive in his 60s, frowned as he recognized what was unfolding. "Karen," he called, approaching with his putter still in hand. "Is there a problem?" "Here. George, I've found someone on the course without proper identification," Karen explained, not lowering her phone. "He claims he's the new golf pro, but he's not in uniform, has no credentials, and I've never seen him before." George looked at Marcus with dawning recognition. "You're Marcus Johnson, aren't you? NCAA champion? Richard mentioned you'd be joining us." Marcus nodded. "That's right, sir." "Of course it is," George said warmly, extending his hand. "Richard's been talking about nothing else for weeks. He's arranged for me to take some lessons with you." Karen's composure faltered, but she didn't lower her phone. "That may be, George, but rules are rules. No identification, no play. It's that simple." Through her phone screen, Karen saw Trevor Williams approaching in a security uniform, walking briskly across the fairway. She felt a surge of vindication. "Ma'am," Trevor said as he arrived, slightly out of breath, "you reported an unauthorized person on the course?" "This man," Karen stated firmly, "claims to be the new golf pro, but he has no identification, no proper attire, and I caught him using the course without authorization." Trevor glanced at Marcus, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Mr. Johnson? I checked you in at the pro shop an hour ago." Karen's face flushed. "You know him?" "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Pearson introduced us yesterday during my shift. Mr. Johnson completed all the temporary credentials paperwork." "Temporary credentials aren't proper credentials," Karen insisted, her voice rising. "And that doesn't explain why he's not in proper attire." By now, several more golfers had paused their games, watching the scene unfold with uncomfortable fascination. Karen was dimly aware of phones being raised around her, other members recording the confrontation. Marcus addressed Trevor directly. "I understand you're doing your job. If you need me to leave the course until Monday when I officially start, I'm happy to comply with official security instructions." The subtle emphasis on official wasn't lost on anyone present. Trevor shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, you've been authorized by the club president and properly checked in. There's no security violation that I can see." Karen's indignation turned to outright anger. "So you're refusing to enforce the rules because Richard made some special exception? This is exactly the problem with standards these days. They only apply to some people." "Karen," George interjected, "you're making a scene over nothing. Marcus is exactly who he says he is." "It's the principle, George," Karen snapped, forgetting herself. "People can't just walk in here claiming to be whatever they want. How do we really know who he is?" Marcus's patient expression finally hardened. "Ma'am, what exactly about me makes you so suspicious? I've identified myself. A club member has verified my identity, and security has confirmed I checked in properly. What more do you need?" Karen felt the situation slipping from her control. "I need you to respect our community standards. Pinecrest has traditions, protocols. People who belong here understand that." "People who belong here?" Marcus repeated, his voice steady but pointed. "And who exactly belongs here, in your estimation?" The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. In that moment, the carefully maintained veneer of Pinecrest's civility cracked, revealing the uglier truth beneath. "I think we all know what this is really about," Marcus continued, his calm voice carrying across the now silent gathering. "And it's not about a missing membership tag." Karen's face flushed deeper. "How dare you imply?" "I'm not implying anything," Marcus cut in. "I'm stating a fact. You saw a black man on your golf course and immediately assumed I didn't belong here." "That is absolutely not," Karen began, but her protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Ma'am," Trevor interjected, "as security, I need to ask you to stop recording and move along. You're disrupting other members' enjoyment of the facility." Karen turned on him, incredulous. "You're asking me to leave? I've been a member here for 15 years. I'm on the board." "I'm not asking you to leave the premises," Trevor clarified, professionalism straining against discomfort. "Just to continue your round and allow others to do the same." "This is absurd," Karen sputtered, lowering her phone but not stopping the recording. "I was simply trying to protect our community, and now I'm being treated like I'm the problem." George stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Karen, for God's sake, walk away. You've made a mistake. Don't make it worse." But Karen had crossed a line she couldn't retreat from. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "But this isn't over. The board will hear about this. All of it. About unauthorized use of facilities, about security refusing to do their job, about the complete disregard for the protocols that make Pinecrest what it is." She turned to Marcus, no longer bothering to mask her disdain. "And you should know that people like you don't get to dictate how things work here. This community has standards that were established long before you arrived, and they'll remain long after you're gone." "People like me?" Marcus repeated, his phone still recording, steadily. "Would you care to elaborate on what you mean by that, Mrs. Whitfield?" A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Karen suddenly realized how many people were watching and recording her every word. She saw the judgment in their eyes, the discomfort, and in some, the quiet agreement they wouldn't dare voice publicly. "You know exactly what I mean," she said, gathering her dignity around her like armor. "People who don't respect traditions, people who expect special treatment, people who cry discrimination when they're simply being held to the same standards as everyone else." With that, she turned and marched back toward her golf cart, her back rigid with righteous indignation. Behind her, she heard the murmur of voices resume, felt the weight of stares on her retreating figure. "This isn't over," she called over her shoulder. "The board will address this on Monday." As she drove away, Karen didn't notice how many phones were still recording, didn't realize that within minutes the videos would begin circulating in Pinecrest group chats. She didn't see Marcus speaking quietly with George and several other members who approached to apologize. She didn't witness Trevor's conflicted expression as he radioed in a carefully worded incident report. She only knew that something precious was under threat, and she had appointed herself its defender. And defenders, even unpopular ones, sometimes had to stand alone. By Sunday morning, Karen Whitfield's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She had silenced it around midnight after the first wave of notifications, but now, staring at the screen through sleepless eyes, she watched in horror as message after message flooded in. The Pinecrest community chat, normally filled with lost pet announcements and contractor recommendations, had exploded with activity, all centered around her. "Have you seen the video?" read a text from Diane. "Call me immediately." Karen's hands trembled as she opened her social media. The first thing she saw was her own face contorted with indignation in a screenshot that had already been shared thousands of times. The caption read, "Golfing while black. Watch this Karen. Harass a professional golfer for being on her course." Another notification pinged, a private message from Richard Pearson. "Emergency board meeting, 3 p.m. today, attendance mandatory, damage control needed." Karen sank onto her pristine white sofa, struggling to breathe. This couldn't be happening. She had only been enforcing the rules that applied to everyone. How had it spiraled so far out of control? Her doorbell rang, startling her badly enough that she dropped her phone. Through the security camera feed, she saw Diane standing on her doorstep, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "I've been calling you for hours," Diane said the moment Karen opened the door. She brushed past her friend into the foyer, clutching her own phone like a lifeline. "It's everywhere, Karen. Not just the community chats, it's on Twitter, on the news sites. They're calling you, well, a Karen." She winced at the unfortunate coincidence of the name. "This is absurd," Karen said, her voice hollow. "I was doing my job as a board member. If anything, I should be receiving support, not this." She gestured weakly at their phones. Diane's expression wavered between loyalty and discomfort. "The thing is, Karen, it doesn't look good. The way you spoke to him, what you said about people like him. There are 3 different camera angles circulating now." "3?" Karen whispered. "The one you took, the one he took, and at least one from another member watching." Diane hesitated. "And Karen, I have to ask, what did you mean by people like him? Karen stiffened. I meant people who expect special treatment, who don't follow the rules. But that's not how it sounds, Diane said quietly, not to anyone watching. Are you taking his side? Karen demanded, stepping back. After 15 years of friendship, you think I'm some kind of racist? Diane flinched. I didn't say that. But I know you, Karen. I've heard how you talk. About maintaining standards and what that usually means. I've nodded along, I've agreed with you because it was easier. But seeing it like this, hearing your words played back. She exhaled slowly. It's making me question things I've let slide for a long time. Before Karen could respond, her phone chimed with an email alert. Subject line, your employment status. They wouldn't dare, she breathed, opening the message from the real estate firm where she maintained her license. Administrative leave pending investigation, she read aloud, disbelief rendering her voice flat. Professional standards review, public statements inconsistent with company values. She looked up at Diane, shock giving way to outrage. This is my life they're destroying over what, asking for identification? Across the community in his newly purchased home on Oak Hollow, Marcus Johnson sat at his kitchen island, methodically responding to messages of support while declining the dozens of interview requests flooding his inbox. His phone rang again, the 8th call from a national morning show, and he sent it to voicemail. A text from Richard Pearson appeared. Marcus, I cannot apologize enough for yesterday's incident. Please know the board is addressing this immediately. I'd appreciate your discretion with the media until we can speak. Marcus noted the request without committing to it. 20 years of navigating predominantly white spaces as a black athlete had taught him to recognize the difference between genuine allyship and institutional self-preservation. Richard's concern seemed squarely in the latter category. A soft knock at his door drew his attention. Through the window he saw Amara Washington on his doorstep, holding a small welcome basket. I thought you might need this, she said when he opened the door, offering a basket that contained, among other things, a bottle of good bourbon. Welcome to Pinecrest. I promise we're not all like her. Marcus smiled for what felt like the first time in 24 hours. Thanks. I've actually been receiving a surprising number of supportive messages. I'm not surprised, Amara said, following him into the kitchen. What might surprise you is how many people have been waiting for a moment like this, a moment when the polite veneer finally cracked. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You don't seem upset about the disruption. Sometimes systems need disruption to change, Amara replied. I've been on that board for 3 years, fighting for inclusive policies, getting politely ignored. And in 24 hours you've managed to expose what I've been pointing at all along. She pulled out her phone and showed him a chat group she'd created. Pinecrest for Change. Already 47 residents had joined. We're organizing to attend the emergency board meeting, she explained. People want accountability, but more importantly, they want structural changes. The diversity committee has had proposals collecting dust for years. Now people are actually reading them. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I've been approached by 3 news outlets for interviews. Are you going to speak with them? Just one, he said, carefully selected with clear talking points. This isn't about me versus Karen Whitfield. That narrative is too easy and changes nothing in the long run. Amara studied him with newfound respect. You've dealt with this before. Many times, Marcus acknowledged. Just usually without such a receptive audience. In the clubhouse management office, Trevor Williams sat uncomfortably across from his supervisor and the club's legal counsel. Walk us through exactly what happened, the lawyer said, recording device prominently displayed on the desk between them. Trevor recounted the incident in precise detail, his uniform feeling unusually tight around his collar. And you recognized Mr. Johnson from a previous introduction? The supervisor asked. Yes, sir. Mr. Pearson had personally introduced us when Mr. Johnson toured the facilities. But you understand that Mrs. Whitfield was following established protocols regarding membership verification? Trevor hesitated. Sir, with all due respect, That's not entirely accurate. We have protocols for requesting membership verification, but they don't include filming members without consent or using language that could be interpreted as discriminatory. The lawyer leaned forward. We're not asking you to characterize Mrs. Whitfield's language, Trevor. We're simply establishing the facts regarding club policy. The implication was clear. Stick to a narrow interpretation of events. Don't volunteer judgments. Trevor straightened in his chair. Sir, the facts are that Mr. Johnson was properly checked in through the pro shop. He had temporary credentials pending his official start date, as arranged by the club president. Mrs. Whitfield escalated the situation unnecessarily and created a public confrontation that made multiple members uncomfortable. The supervisor and lawyer exchanged glances. Your handling of the situation is not under review at this time, the supervisor said carefully. But should the matter escalate to legal proceedings, the club would expect your discretion and loyalty. Trevor understood the veiled message. His job security depended on minimizing his employer's liability, not on speaking uncomfortable truths. I understand, sir, he replied, but I also understand that those videos are already public. My actions and words are already documented from multiple angles. It was a subtle but clear message. He couldn't be pressured to change his story when the evidence was already out there. At 2:45 p.m., Richard Pearson paced his office rehearsing opening remarks for the emergency board meeting. The club's PR firm had sent over talking points, emphasizing Pinecrest's commitment to diversity and zero tolerance for discrimination, phrases that felt hollow, given the community's actual demographics and history. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Exclusive. Golf pro speaks out on viral Karen confrontation. Richard clicked the link with a sense of dread. On screen, Marcus Johnson appeared, composed and professional in a crisp, button-down shirt, speaking with measured precision. This incident reflects a broader pattern in exclusive communities like Pinecrest, Marcus was saying. The question isn't whether one individual acted inappropriately. The videos speak for themselves. The question is why communities establish cultures where some people are automatically seen as belonging and others are automatically suspected of trespassing. The interviewer nodded sympathetically. You were literally hired as a golf professional at this club. You'd been introduced to staff. You'd purchased a home there. And still, you were treated as an intruder. That's the reality many people, of color face regardless of credentials, accomplishments, or status, Marcus replied. You can change the policies on paper, but until the culture changes, until people examine their instinctive assumptions about who belongs, these incidents will continue. Richard turned off the video with a groan. Unlike most crisis managers, Marcus was refusing to personalize the conflict. He was speaking like a community leader, not a victim, and that made him far more dangerous to the status quo Richard had spent years maintaining. Back in her living room, Karen stared at her laptop screen in disbelief as her neighborhood reputation disintegrated before her eyes. The Pinecrest Community Forum had split into factions, a small but vocal group defending her actions, a larger contingent expressing outrage, and a disturbing number of people sharing their own stories of feeling marginalized or unwelcome at Pinecrest. I've lived here 5 years and still get asked if I'm someone's housekeeper when I use the pool, wrote one resident, a Latina doctor whom Karen recognized from community events. Not surprised, replied another member. Remember when they rejected the Diwali celebration proposal because candles are a fire hazard but approved hundreds of luminaries for Christmas? Karen scrolled frantically, searching for supporters, finding only a dwindling handful of comments suggesting she had been technically correct about the rules, if perhaps overzealous in enforcement. The doorbell rang again. This time it was a delivery, a large manila envelope hand-delivered by courier. Inside, she found a formal notice from the HOA board. Temporary suspension of board privileges pending review. Her vision blurred with tears of outrage and humiliation. Only yesterday morning she had been Karen Whitfield, respected board member and community standard bearer. Now she was that Karen, being vilified across social media, suspended from her job and board position, abandoned by friends, and portrayed as the embodiment of petty racism. The worst part was that no one seemed to care about her side of the story. The rules existed for everyone's benefit. Standards maintained their property values and community character. Without people like her enforcing those standards, what would become of Pinecrest? Her phone rang. Diane again. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, her friend said without preamble. "I know you received the suspension notice, but you should know what you're walking into if you decide to attend anyway." "Walking into?" Karen repeated. "Amara has organized at least 30 residents to attend. They're calling for your removal from the board, not just a suspension. They have a list of demands about community policies. And," Diane hesitated, "I've been thinking about what you said about people like him." "Don't you start too," Karen snapped. "Here's the thing, Karen," Diane continued, her voice gaining resolve. "I've heard you make comments like that for years. About the Patels, about Amara, about the Rodriguezes when they moved in. Always couched in terms of community standards, always technically about rules, but always directed at anyone who didn't fit a very specific mold." "That's absolutely untrue," Karen protested. "I hold everyone to the same standards." "Do you?" Diane challenged. "Did you confront Senator Bradley's son when he had that loud party that went past noise curfew? Did you report the Williamsons when they painted their shed that non-regulation color? Or was it just easier to focus on the people who already stood out?" Karen's silence hung heavy between them. "I'll see you at the meeting," Diane finally said. "But I won't be sitting next to you. I need to start making different choices about where I stand." The line went dead, leaving Karen alone with a truth she wasn't ready to face. At exactly 3 p.m., Richard Pearson called the emergency board meeting to order in a clubhouse conference, room filled beyond capacity. Board members sat stiffly at the main table while rows of residents filled every available chair, with more standing along the walls. Karen's seat remained conspicuously empty. "In light of recent events," Richard began, his practiced corporate tone betraying only the slightest tremor, "the board has called this emergency session to address community concerns and reaffirm Pinecrest's commitment to being a welcoming, inclusive environment for all residents." A murmur rippled through the crowd, skepticism from some, determination from others. "To that end," Richard continued, trying to recapture control of the narrative, "I'm announcing a special community-wide meeting this Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. This will provide a forum for all residents to express their concerns and for the board to present our action plan moving forward." From her position near the front, Amara Washington stood. "With respect, Mr. Pearson, we don't need to wait until Wednesday to begin addressing this situation. I have a petition signed by 58 residents requesting immediate action on 3 fronts." Richard blinked rapidly, visibly thrown by the organized response. "Ms. Washington, we appreciate your initiative, but proper procedure, Amara interrupted firmly, is what allows discrimination to continue unaddressed. The community isn't asking for discussion, we're asking for action." As if on cue, the conference room door opened and Marcus Johnson entered. A hush fell over the crowd. He nodded respectfully to Richard and took a seat in the back, his presence transforming the dynamic of the room. Richard glanced at the other board members, finding no help in their uncomfortable expressions. The carefully maintained facade of Pinecrest, the polite deflections, the procedural delays, the appearance of harmony at all costs, was crumbling before him. For the first time in his tenure as president, he faced a situation that couldn't be managed with platitudes or postponed until passions cooled. "Very well," he said finally. "Let's hear these demands." Outside in the parking lot, Karen sat, in her car, unable to make herself walk into the building. Through the window she could see residents still arriving, many of whom had previously smiled at her or thanked her for her service to the community. Now they walked past without seeing her, intent on joining what she increasingly recognized as a referendum on her character, and by extension on the Pinecrest she had fought to preserve. Her phone buzzed with a text from the only board member who had reached out personally. "They're calling for your resignation. It's going to be a bloodbath. Maybe better to stay away." Karen started her engine. She would not sit in that parking lot and watch her community turn against her. Let them have their meeting, their petitions, their moral outrage. She had only been doing what she believed was right, but as she drove through the gates of Pinecrest, past the manicured entrance where fresh flowers were planted weekly in precise patterns, she couldn't silence the echo of Diane's question. Did you confront Senator Bradley's son? Did you report the Williamsons? The uncomfortable truth followed her home, waiting to be faced when her anger finally gave way to reflection. By Wednesday evening, the Pinecrest clubhouse had never seen such attendance for a community meeting. Residents arrived 30 minutes early, forming a line that stretched from the grand ballroom doors to the circular driveway outside. Security guards, unfamiliar faces hired specifically for the event, checked membership IDs with unprecedented diligence. Inside, Richard Pearson paced behind the podium, reviewing his carefully prepared statement one last time. The PR firm had been explicit. Acknowledge the issue without admitting liability, emphasize community values without specifying what those values were, and above all, project calm authority. This will blow over, the PR consultant had assured him that morning. Communities like Pinecrest weather these storms by presenting a united front. Focus on process, not emotion. But as Richard watched the room fill to capacity, he recognized that the faces before him were anything but united. Residents clustered in obvious factions, Amara's coalition on the left side of the room, carrying folders of documents, long-time members and Karen's allies to the right, many wearing Pinecrest-branded apparel as if to emphasize their belonging. And in between, the uncertain majority, neighbors who normally avoided conflict but now found themselves forced to choose sides. At precisely 7 p.m., Richard tapped the microphone. Good evening, residents of Pinecrest Estates, he began, his boardroom voice carrying across the now hushed room. I want to thank you all for coming tonight to discuss recent events that have affected our community. As your HOA president, for the past 6 years I've always prioritized maintaining the prestigious reputation and property values that make Pinecrest special. A murmur rippled through Amara's section. However, Richard continued, raising his voice slightly, recent events have highlighted the need for thoughtful dialogue about our community standards and practices. The board is committed to ensuring that Pinecrest remains a welcoming environment for all residents while preserving the quality of life we all value. From the second row, an older gentleman in a golf sweater stood up. Cut the corporate speak, Richard. We're here about that woman harassing our new golf pro. Plain and simple. Harold, please, Richard replied, gesturing for him to sit. We have a process for these discussions. Process is exactly the problem, Amara interjected, rising from her seat. Process is how legitimate concerns get buried in committees and discussions until people stop paying attention. Richard's jaw tightened. Ms. Washington, we agreed that after my introduction you would have 10 minutes to present your coalition's concerns. If we could just follow the agenda. From the back of the room, a woman's voice cut through the tension. How about we hear from the person who's been unfairly vilified before we start restructuring the entire community? Heads turned as Karen Whitfield strode down the center aisle, chin high despite the whispers that followed her. She wore a Pinecrest polo shirt and pearl earrings, the uniform of belonging she had defended for years. Karen, Richard said, visibly flustered, I thought we agreed you would. I've changed my mind, she replied, approaching the podium. This is still my community, and I have the right to address false accusations before they're enshrined as truth. The room erupted, shouts of support from some quarters, protests from others. Richard's attempts to restore order went unheeded as Karen reached for the microphone. Please, she said, her amplified voice cutting through the chaos. I've served this community faithfully for 8 years. I deserve 5 minutes to speak. Richard hesitated, then nodded curtly, stepping aside while keeping a hand on the podium as if ready to reclaim it at any moment. Karen faced the divided room, her rehearsed speech momentarily forgotten as she absorbed the hostility from so many familiar faces. I want to be clear, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. What happened Saturday was not about race. It was about rules that apply to everyone, regardless of who they are. I didn't know Marcus Johnson. I saw someone using our facilities without proper identification, and I did what any responsible board member would do. I asked for credentials. From Amara's section came a loud scoff. "You can disagree," Karen continued, focusing on friendly. But my concern has always been protecting what makes Pinecrest special. Our standards, our protocols, our community character. If that now makes me a villain, then I have to wonder what values we're actually defending." She paused, gaining confidence from the nods of agreement from her supporters. "The real question is whether we want to maintain the Pinecrest we all chose to live in, or whether we'll let one incident, blown completely out of proportion by social media and outside agitators, fundamentally change the community we've built." The ballroom temperature seemed to rise with tension. From his seat in the middle section, Marcus Johnson watched silently, his expression unreadable. Beside him, George Hathaway shook his head in dismay. "The woman is digging herself deeper," he muttered to Marcus. "She doesn't even hear what she's saying." Amara stood again, this time without waiting for recognition. "Mrs. Whitfield, would you have approached a white resident the same way? Would you have filmed them, called security, used phrases like, 'people like you'?" "This isn't a cross-examination," Karen replied defensively. "And yes, I would have questioned anyone I didn't recognize who couldn't produce proper credentials." From the back of the room, a voice called out, "That's not true. My son had friends using the tennis courts without tags last summer, and you waved hello when you walked past." "That was different," Karen insisted. "I recognized your son." "That's exactly the point," Amara interrupted. "You recognize who belongs and who doesn't based on your own biases, not on actual rules. Rules are just the excuse." The room exploded again, residents shouting over each other as Richard desperately tried to regain control. Karen gripped the podium, her composure cracking. "This is absurd," she declared. "I'm being scapegoated for doing my job while real problems, declining property values, security concerns, community standards, are ignored in favor of virtue signaling." "Please," Richard finally shouted, his corporate veneer shattering. "One speaker at a time." Into this chaos, an unexpected voice emerged, not shouting but clear enough to draw attention. "I'd like to speak, if I may." Marcus Johnson stood, his calm presence immediately commanding attention. The room quieted, curiosity overriding argument. Even Karen stepped back from the podium, suddenly aware of how she must appear. Marcus walked deliberately to the front, nodding respectfully to both Richard and Karen before facing the residents. "I didn't come to Pinecrest looking for conflict," he began. "I came because I was offered a professional opportunity at a prestigious club, and because I liked the idea of living in a community where excellence is valued." He paused, looking around the room. But excellence and exclusivity aren't the same thing, though they're often confused. The room remained silent, residents leaning forward to catch every word. "What happened Saturday wasn't just about me or about Mrs. Whitfield," Marcus continued. "It was about who gets the benefit of the doubt in spaces like this. Who is assumed to belong and who has to continuously prove their right to be here." He gestured toward Amara and the handful of other residents of color scattered throughout the room. "Ask your neighbors who look like me how often they're questioned at the pool, or followed by security when they're jogging, or watched a little too closely at community events." Rules don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the context of who enforces them, against whom, and how vigorously. Karen shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "I don't want Mrs. Whitfield's removal from the board if it's just about punishment," Marcus said, surprising many in the room. "Replacing one person doesn't fix a culture. What I want, what I believe many of us want, is a community that's genuinely committed to belonging, not just to exclusivity." From across the room, Amara spoke up. "That's why our coalition has prepared specific proposals for policy changes." She held up a document, including anti-discrimination training for board members and staff, transparent enforcement of rules with documentation of all incidents, and a diversity committee with actual authority to review community practices. "These proposals are completely unnecessary," a man in a Pinecrest hat objected. "We don't have a discrimination problem. We have a social media problem and a persecution complex problem." The comment triggered another wave of shouting. An older woman stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. My husband and I have lived here for 20 years and we've never had any issues. With all due respect, Mrs. Campbell, replied a younger resident, a South Asian man in his 30s. You've never had issues because you fit the profile of who belongs here. My family gets questioned by security twice a month on average. That's not about race, Karen interjected from beside the podium. It's about familiarity. Long-standing members are naturally recognized more easily. Then why did security recognize me immediately? Marcus asked quietly. While you, a board member, claimed never to have heard of me despite Richard's announcement at last week's meeting. Karen flushed. I was distracted during that announcement. Convenient, someone muttered loudly enough to be heard. Richard attempted to steer the conversation back to procedure. Perhaps we should proceed with Ms. Washington's presentation of the formal proposals, followed by structured discussion. This is a waste of time, interrupted an elderly resident, rising shakily to his feet. I've been on 3 boards in this community since 1998. We've never needed anti-discrimination training or diversity committees. What's next? Quotas for who can buy homes here? A chorus of agreement rose from Karen's supporters, while Amara's coalition responded, with outrage. This is exactly the problem, Amara shouted over the din. The automatic assumption that inclusion somehow diminishes the community rather than strengthens it. The meeting had completely derailed. Some residents had risen from their seats, confronting each other in heated exchanges throughout the room. Richard stood helplessly at the podium, his authority evaporated. Karen watched with a mixture of vindication and dismay as the community she thought she knew revealed its deep fractures. Marcus stepped back to the microphone. Enough, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. The room gradually quieted again. Look at yourselves, he said, gesturing to the divided room. Is this the community any of you want to live in? One that tears itself apart rather than confronting uncomfortable truths? He turned to Karen. Mrs. Whitfield, you say you love this community and want to protect it. I believe that. But you can't protect something by suffocating it, by freezing it in time, by deciding who belongs and who doesn't based on your personal comfort. Then to Richard. And Mr. Pearson, leadership isn't about avoiding conflict, it's about navigating through it towards something better. Finally, he addressed the whole room. We have a choice to make, not just about Mrs. Whitfield's board position or about specific policies, but about what kind of community Pinecrest wants to be going forward. One defined by who it keeps out, or one defined by the values it actually stands for. The silence that followed felt weightier than all the shouting that had preceded it. Into this silence, Diane Calloway rose from her seat in the middle section, not with Karen's supporters nor with Amara's coalition. I've known Karen Whitfield for 15 years, she said, her voice wavering. She's been my friend, my neighbor, my fellow board member, and I have to say, she paused, looking directly at Karen. I've been complicit in every instance of selective enforcement, every dismissal of certain people's concerns, every time we prioritized appearances over fairness. I didn't speak up because it was easier not to, because I benefited from the system as it was. Karen stared at her friend in disbelief. Diane, what are you doing? I'm finally being honest, Diane replied. We can't fix what we won't acknowledge. Richard, sensing a potential path forward through the chaos, stepped back to the microphone. I think we need to formalize this discussion with a clear process. I propose we schedule a formal vote in 1 week's time, addressing 2 separate questions. First, whether Mrs. Whitfield should retain her board position, and second, whether to adopt the policy proposals presented by Ms. Washington's coalition. The suggestion of concrete action seemed to release some of the tension in the room. Residents began to nod, even as they remained clearly divided on how they would vote. A week allows time for everyone to review the proposals in detail. Richard continued, regaining some composure. And for reflection on how we want to move forward as a community. Amara stepped forward. We agree to the timeline, but with one condition. The policy proposals are voted on regardless of the outcome of the vote on Mrs. Whitfield. This isn't just about one person. Richard hesitated. then nodded. Agreed. Karen looked around. The room had faces she'd known for years now regarding her with emotions ranging from support to disgust. And if I'm voted off the board? What then? Do I become a pariah in my own community? Is that your vision of inclusion? That's not what this is about, Marcus replied. It's about accountability and recognition that actions have consequences. The community needs to heal, but healing isn't the same as pretending nothing happened. As the meeting began to break up, residents clustered in intense discussion about the upcoming vote. The battle lines were drawn, not just around Karen's fate, but around competing visions of what Pinecrest was and should be. Karen found herself standing alone near the podium as residents filed out. Even most of her supporters seemed reluctant to approach her directly, offering encouraging nods from a distance instead. The isolation stung worse than the criticism. "Mrs. Whitfield," Marcus said, approaching her as the room emptied. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're a monster. I think you're someone who has benefited from a certain system for so long that you can't see how it harms others." Karen stiffened. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed, "but I know the role you've played in this community, and I know that roles can change if people are willing." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, joining Amara and her group, who waited by the exit. Karen watched as they left together, already strategizing for the vote that would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future character of the community she had fought so hard to preserve. In the nearly empty ballroom, Richard gathered, his notes feeling the weight of the coming week pressing down on him. He had built his reputation on maintaining harmony, on finding middle ground, on preserving Pinecrest's pristine image at all costs. Now he faced a community divided along lines that couldn't be papered over with procedural solutions or carefully worded statements. For the first time, he understood that neutrality was its own kind of statement, one that had allowed injustice to persist beneath Pinecrest's manicured surface for far too long. The formal vote was scheduled for the following Wednesday, giving both sides exactly 7 days to rally support, persuade the undecided, and make their case for what Pinecrest should become. 7 days that would reveal the true character of a community forced to confront the uncomfortable question of who truly belonged within its gates. The morning after the community meeting, Karen Whitfield stood in her kitchen staring at her phone. 23 missed calls from her daughter Ashley at Vanderbilt, the inevitable conversation she'd been avoiding since the video went viral. When the phone rang again, Karen finally answered. "Mom, what the hell?" Ashley's voice was tight with anger and something worse, disappointment. "I'm sitting in the student center, and people I don't even know are showing me videos of my mother harassing a black man on a golf course." "Ashley, it's being completely misrepresented," Karen began, falling back on the defense she'd rehearsed. "If you'd just let me explain." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Explain what?" "I watched it, Mom. All 3 videos. I heard what you said about people like him." Ashley's voice cracked. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? My roommate's boyfriend is black. What am I supposed to tell them?" Karen sank onto a kitchen stool. "You tell them that your mother was enforcing community rules that apply to everyone, and that race had nothing to do with it." "Really? Nothing?" The skepticism in Ashley's voice cut deep. "Because that's not what it looks like to anyone watching. It looks like exactly the kind of thing you taught me not to do." "What are you talking about?" Karen asked. "Don't play dumb, Mom. All those comments over the years, about the changing neighborhood when that Indian family moved in down the street, about how the Rodriguez's quinceañera was disrupting the community character. You've always had a problem with anyone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs." Karen felt as if the floor were tilting beneath her. "That's not fair. I've never—" "Stop it," Ashley interrupted. "Just stop. I love you, but I need you to be honest. If not with me, then at least with yourself." She paused. "Professor Davis has us reading this book about implicit bias, and it talks about how the most dangerous prejudice is the kind we deny we have. So now I'm getting a lecture on racism from my 20-year-old daughter who's never had to maintain a community's standards? Karen's voice rose defensively. There it is again, Ashley said quietly. Community standards. That's always been your shield, hasn't it? Using rules to justify treating certain people differently. The silence between them stretched painfully. I have to go to class, Ashley finally said. But Mom, please. Just think about it. Not about your reputation or the community, or any of that. Just about what you really saw when you looked at that man on the golf course and why. After they hung up, Karen remained motionless in her sunlit kitchen, surrounded by the perfect order she'd always maintained. The alphabetized spice rack, the color-coordinated dish towels, the precisely arranged fruit bowl. For the first time, she wondered if her need for control extended beyond her environment to the people within it. The thought made her deeply uncomfortable. It was easier to be the victim of cancel culture, to be misunderstood and unfairly maligned. The alternative, that Ashley might be right, was almost unbearable to consider. Across Pinecrest in the club president's office, Richard Pearson sat across from Marcus Johnson in an uncomfortable silence. He'd invited the golf pro for what he'd intended to be a diplomatic smoothing over, perhaps even a private negotiation to reduce tensions before the vote. What he hadn't expected was Marcus's calm dismantling of every attempt at superficial reconciliation. With all due respect, Mr. Pearson, Marcus was saying, I'm not interested in public apologies or symbolic gestures. I'm interested in substantive change. Richard shifted in his seat. Of course, and the board is fully committed to reviewing the proposals from Ms. Washington's group. Reviewing isn't implementing, Marcus interrupted. And I've seen how review processes can be used to delay action until momentum fades. Richard sighed, abandoning his prepared talking points. What exactly do you want, Mr. Johnson? I want Pinecrest to be what it claims to be, Marcus replied simply. A community of excellence. But real excellence isn't about exclusivity or property values. It's about creating an environment where everyone can thrive, where rules are applied fairly, and where difference is seen as an asset rather than a threat. That sounds admirable in theory, Richard said carefully. But in practice, we're talking about significant changes to how this community has operated for decades. Change takes time. Marcus leaned forward. Let me be direct. I've been approached by 3 national media outlets this week. I've declined them all because I believe this community might be capable of meaningful self-reflection. But my patience isn't unlimited. The implicit threat hung in the air between them. Are you blackmailing me? Richard asked incredulously. I'm being transparent about leverage, Marcus replied. This isn't about me versus Mrs. Whitfield or even about one incident. It's about patterns of behavior that have gone unchallenged for too long. You've been president for 6 years. How many discrimination complaints have crossed your desk during that time? Richard's hesitation was answer enough. That's what I thought, Marcus continued. How many were taken seriously? How many resulted in action? Or were they all conveniently filed away to protect the community's image? Richard stood abruptly, pacing to the window overlooking the first tee. You don't understand the pressures of this position. Balancing different interests, maintaining harmony, maintaining the status quo, you mean? Marcus interjected. And I understand perfectly. I've navigated predominantly white institutions my entire career. The difference is, I've never had the luxury of ignoring discrimination when I saw it. Richard turned back to face him. What would you have done? In my position? Led, Marcus answered simply. Even when it was uncomfortable, even when it cost you something. The directness of the answer left Richard momentarily speechless. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Gerald Thornton, one of Pinecrest's wealthiest and most influential residents. Need to discuss property value protection before vote. Concerned about radical changes. Call ASAP. Richard silenced his phone, but not before Marcus noticed his expression. Let me guess, Marcus said. The old guard is worried about what all this means for their investments. Richard didn't deny it. People have their life savings tied up in their homes here. And some people have their dignity and safety tied up in how they're treated when they live in those homes, Marcus countered. Which matters more? The question lingered as Marcus stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "I don't actually want to be your adversary, Mr. Pearson. I came here to teach golf and to live in a nice community. But I won't be treated as less than because of what I look like, and I won't be quiet about it when I see it happening to others." After Marcus left, Richard sat heavily in his chair, the weight of competing pressures bearing down on him. Throughout his career, first in corporate banking, then in community management, he had prided himself on finding middle ground, on smoothing over conflicts, on maintaining appearances at all costs. But what if that approach had been part of the problem all along? In Amara Washington's home office, stacks of documents covered every surface. As co-chair of the Diversity Committee, a largely ceremonial position until now, she had access to committee records going back 5 years. What she hadn't expected to find was a pattern of buried complaints. Her phone rang, Trevor Williams calling from his apartment after his security shift. "Did you get the files I sent?" he asked without preamble. "Just opened them," Amara replied, scanning the spreadsheet he'd emailed. "What am I looking at exactly?" "Security incident reports from the past 2 years," Trevor explained. "I've highlighted the ones involving residents or guests of color. Notice anything?" Amara scrolled through the data, her expression hardening. "The escalation rates. White residents with rule violations get verbal warnings 87% of the time. People of color get formal reports filed in 64% of cases." "Exactly," Trevor confirmed. "And it gets worse. Look at the visitor column. White guests are challenged for ID at a quarter of the rate of non-white visitors." Amara leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. Trevor, this is exactly what we need. Concrete evidence of systemic issues, not just individual incidents." "I know," he replied, his voice tense. "Which is why I'm probably going to lose my job for sending it to you. They can't fire you for whistleblowing." "Sure they can. Georgia's an at-will employment state. They won't say it's for the data leak. They'll find something else." Amara was silent for a moment. "Why are you doing this? Why risk it?" Trevor's response came slowly. "When I took this job, I told myself I was just enforcing rules equally for everyone. But the data doesn't lie. I've been part of a system that treats people differently based on how they look, and I can't keep pretending I don't see it." "Thank you," Amara said simply. "This changes everything for the vote." After they hung up, Amara turned to her laptop and began strategizing how to present the evidence at the upcoming vote. This wasn't just about Karen Whitfield anymore. It was about bringing to light a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Meanwhile, Karen sat alone in her living room when the doorbell rang. Through the security camera, she saw Diane standing on her doorstep, looking resolved but uncomfortable. Karen hesitated before opening the door. Their last conversation still stung, and Diane's public abandonment at the community meeting had felt like the deepest betrayal. "I thought we should talk," Diane said when Karen finally opened the door. Privately, before the vote. Karen's response was cold. "I think you made your position quite clear at the meeting, standing with them against me after 15 years of friendship." "I wasn't standing against you," Diane replied, following Karen into the house despite not being explicitly invited. "I was finally being honest about things I should have spoken up about long ago." "Such as?" Karen demanded, arms crossed defensively. "Such as the time you suggested the Patels shouldn't host a Diwali gathering because cultural events should be kept private. Or when you questioned whether Ms. Washington was board material before she was elected. Or when you scrutinized the Rodriguez family's guest list for their daughter's birthday, but said nothing when the Bradleys had twice as many cars parked on the street for their Super Bowl party." Karen's face flushed. "Those were completely different situations." "Were they?" Diane interrupted. "Or were they situations where you applied different standards to different people, and I stood by silently because it was easier than confronting you, because I was comfortable with the status quo?" "So now you're some kind of social justice warrior?" Karen scoffed. "After benefiting from the very community standards you're suddenly so concerned about?" "No," Diane admitted, sinking onto the sofa. "I'm someone who's finally being honest about my own complicity. And it doesn't feel good, Karen. It feels terrible to realize how much harm I've enabled through my silence. Karen remained standing, her posture rigid. I've done nothing wrong. I've only ever tried to preserve what makes Pinecrest special. And that's the problem, Diane said quietly. You've convinced yourself that special means exclusive, that maintaining standards means keeping certain people out, or in their place. That's not what It is, though, Diane insisted. Maybe not consciously. Maybe you don't wake up thinking, I'm going to discriminate today. But the impact is the same, regardless of your intention. Karen finally sat, the weight of accumulated confrontations, Ashley, the community meeting, and now Diane, becoming too heavy to bear while standing. So what do you want from me? She asked, her voice hollow. A public confession? Self-flagellation? Should I just accept being cast as the villain in this morality play? I want you to really reflect, Diane answered. Not defensively, not thinking about your reputation, but honestly. About why you reacted to Marcus the way you did. About whether you truly enforce rules the same way for everyone. About what you actually mean when you talk about community, standards, and who belongs here. Karen was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its defensive edge. And if I conclude that you're wrong, that I really was just doing my job, then you can vote with that conviction next week, Diane replied. But if you find even a grain of truth in what I'm saying, in what Ashley is saying, in what Marcus and Amara and Trevor are saying, then maybe it's time to consider a different path forward. As Diane left, Karen remained on the sofa, unmoving, as the afternoon light slowly shifted across her living room. For the first time, she allowed herself to replay the golf course confrontation without the protective shield of righteous indignation. What had she actually seen when she spotted Marcus on that tee? A rule breaker? Or a black man where she didn't expect to see one? The question followed her through a sleepless night. In their bedroom across Pinecrest, Richard and his wife, Patricia, prepared for bed in unusual silence. The tension that had been building since the community meeting finally broke when Patricia closed her book with deliberate care. You're going to have to take a real position, she said quietly. No more hiding behind procedure and committee reviews. Richard sighed, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed. It's not that simple, Patty. There are significant divisions in the community. Property values, the club's reputation. Stop, Patricia interrupted. Just stop with the corporate speak for 1 minute and be honest. This isn't about property values. It's about whether we're willing to admit that Pinecrest has a problem with race. Richard looked at his wife in surprise. They rarely discussed community politics at home. An unspoken agreement that his HOA presidency wouldn't invade their personal life. You've never said anything before, he noted. Because I've been part of the problem, Patricia admitted. Just like everyone else who sees things and says nothing. But I can't stay silent anymore, and neither can you. Richard rubbed his face tiredly. Gerald Thornton called today. He and several other influential members are concerned about radical changes threatening the community character. You mean they're worried that if black and brown people feel too welcome, Pinecrest won't be exclusive enough anymore, Patricia? Translated bluntly. It's more complicated. It's really not, she cut in. And if you're honest with yourself, you know it. She paused, studying her husband. Remember when we were considering buying in Pinecrest 12 years ago? The realtor told us it was a traditional community with stable demographics. Richard nodded slowly. I knew what she meant. We all did. And we accepted it because it benefited us. Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. But accepting injustice, even passively, eventually corrupts everyone involved, including us. Richard was quiet for a long moment. If I take a strong stand, I'll lose the presidency at the next election. The old guard will make sure of it. Then lose it, Patricia said simply. Some things matter more than titles and influence, Richard. Like being able to look yourself in the mirror. As the night deepened, 5 people across Pinecrest lay awake, confronting truths about themselves they had long avoided. Karen, finally allowing herself to question whether her dedication to standards had become a shield for deeper biases she didn't want to acknowledge. Richard, recognizing that his conflict avoidance had enabled discrimination to flourish under the guise of tradition and protocol. Diane, grappling with her years of silent complicity in a system that had harmed others while benefiting her. Trevor, accepting that enforcing unjust rules made him part of the injustice, regardless of his personal beliefs. And Amara, understanding that the fight ahead wasn't just about changing policies, but about changing hearts and minds, including her own tendency to see people as either allies or obstacles rather than as complex individuals capable of growth. Only Marcus slept soundly, having faced these reckonings long ago in his journey through spaces never designed with him in mind. As dawn broke over Pinecrest's manicured landscapes, the vote was just 5 days away. For some, it had become about more than Karen's board position or specific policy proposals. It had become a referendum on personal integrity, on the courage to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, and on what kind of community and people they truly wanted to be. The Wednesday of the vote arrived with dark clouds mirroring the tension that had built over Pinecrest. By early evening, the clubhouse parking lot overflowed, with security checking membership IDs at the doors with unusual scrutiny. Inside, the grand ballroom. 2 podiums faced each other at the front with the board table between them and chairs arranged in a semicircle. As residents filed in, they automatically clustered with like-minded neighbors, the community's divisions physically manifest. In the adjacent boardroom, Gerald Thornton cornered Richard Pearson in a last-minute attempt to derail the proceedings. "This is unnecessary," insisted the silver-haired investment banker. "Karen takes a voluntary leave. We form a committee to review the proposals over 6 months. Everyone saves face." Richard glanced at his watch. "We've tried that approach for years. Form a committee, issue a report that sits on a shelf. It doesn't work anymore." "Then what? Throw Karen to the wolves? Overturn decades of governance over one incident?" Richard straightened his tie, a decision crystallizing within him. "No. I suggest we finally have an honest conversation about the community we claim to be versus the one we've actually built, and then vote on whether we want those two things to align." He entered the packed ballroom, which immediately hushed. Taking his place at the center of the board table, he tapped the microphone. "Good evening," he began. "We will first hear statements regarding Mrs. Whitfield's board position, followed by a presentation of the proposed policy changes. After discussion, we'll vote on each matter separately." He paused, scanning the room. Karen sitting stiffly in the front row surrounded by supporters. Amara at her table covered with documents. Marcus observing quietly. Diane sitting apart from her usual circle. "I ask that everyone remember we are neighbors first," Richard continued. "How we conduct ourselves tonight will shape our community long after these specific issues are resolved." The doors opened, and Trevor Williams entered in his security uniform despite being off duty. He stood at the back, causing whispers to ripple through the crowd. "Mrs. Whitfield has requested to speak first," Richard announced. Karen approached the podium with measured steps, spine rigid, clutching a folder of notes. She wore a conservative, navy dress and pearl earrings that caught the light as she arranged her papers. "Thank you, Richard," she began. "Neighbors, friends, I stand before you at the center of a controversy that has divided our community and brought unwelcome attention to Pinecrest." She scanned the faces before her, some sympathetic, others hostile, many unreadable. "I acknowledge that my actions created a situation that spiraled beyond expectations. For that I apologize." The words came out slightly mechanical. "My intention was to enforce our community standards, as I've done faithfully for 8 years. If my approach was overzealous, I regret that." From Amara's section came a soft but audible scoff. "However," Karen continued defensively, "I reject the characterization of my actions as racially motivated. Those who know me understand that I've always been dedicated to maintaining the excellence that makes Pinecrest special, regardless of who is involved." She turned a page. "Removing me from the board for doing my job sets a dangerous precedent. It suggests that enforcing our rules is now punishable if the subject happens to be a person of color. That's not equality, that's preferential treatment. The room tensed visibly as she continued. As for the policy proposals, while some may have merit, rushing to implement sweeping changes based on a single incident is reactionary. I urge this community to separate the question of my board position from the broader policy discussion. As Karen returned to her seat, the response was tellingly divided. Polite applause from supporters, stony silence from the rest. Richard nodded to Amara. Ms. Washington, please present the coalition's case. Amara approached with purposeful energy, carrying a tablet rather than papers, dressed in a vibrant blue dress that seemed to signal her refusal to be diminished. Thank you, she began. I'd like to clarify that this is not about punishing one person for one incident. This is about acknowledging a pattern and committing to change. She tapped her tablet, and a projection screen lowered. Over the past week, we've compiled evidence of selective rule enforcement at Pinecrest. The screen displayed charts from Trevor's security data. These records show that residents and visitors of color were over 3 times more likely to receive formal complaints for rule violations, while white residents were overwhelmingly given informal warnings for identical infractions. A murmur ran through the crowd as Karen's supporters shifted uncomfortably. Additionally, we've uncovered 12 formal discrimination complaints filed with the board since 2019. None received substantive investigation. She glanced meaningfully at Richard, who looked discomfited. This isn't about one person's bias. It's about a system that enables bias to go unchecked. Amara's voice grew passionate. Mrs. Whitfield's confrontation with Mr. Johnson didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a community where certain people are automatically suspect, where belonging is conditional. She turned to a slide showing their proposals. Our coalition is proposing 5 specific changes: a resident-led diversity committee with actual authority, mandatory anti-bias training, transparent documentation of rule enforcement, a revised complaint process with outside review, and community events designed to build bridges across different backgrounds. The tension was palpable as Amara returned to her seat. Before Richard could speak, Marcus stood. "If I may," he said quietly. Richard nodded. "Mr. Johnson, you have the floor." Marcus walked to the center of the room rather than to either podium, positioning himself as neither accuser nor defender. "I've been listening carefully," he began, "and I think we're missing something important. This conversation isn't really about Mrs. Whitfield or even specific policies. It's about what kind of community Pinecrest wants to be." He turned slowly, making eye contact around the room. "The incident happened to me, so perhaps I have a unique perspective. Mrs. Whitfield's actions hurt me. They made me feel unwelcome in my new home, questioned my right to exist in a space where I belonged." Karen stared at the floor, flushed. "But I don't believe punishment creates transformation," Marcus continued. "Removing Mrs. Whitfield might satisfy a desire for consequences, but would it change the underlying culture that made her actions seem acceptable?" He paused, allowing the question to hang in the air. "I'd like to propose a different approach. Instead of removal, I suggest a restorative process, one where she works directly with the diversity committee to understand the impact of her actions and helps implement the very policies that would prevent similar incidents." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the room. "To be clear," Marcus continued, "I fully support all 5 policy proposals Ms. Washington presented. They're necessary and overdue, but transformation requires both accountability and opportunity for growth. Mrs. Whitfield can either leave as a martyr to her supporters or be part of building a more inclusive Pinecrest. I know which would create more lasting change." As Marcus returned to his seat, the room erupted in discussion. Richard called for order several times. "This is procedurally irregular," he acknowledged. "But given the circumstances, I believe we should consider Mr. Johnson's alternative proposal alongside the original motion." From the back, Trevor stepped forward. "Before we vote, there's something else the community should know." Despite his uniform, he clearly wasn't speaking, officially. The security data Ms. Washington presented came from me. I've documented years of disparate treatment, and I've watched the system protect itself rather than the people it's supposed to serve. He squared his shoulders. I'll likely lose my job for speaking out, but some things matter more. The truth is, Pinecrest has two sets of rules, one for people who look like they belong and another for everyone else. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling heavily. Richard cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Williams, for your courage. He surveyed the room. Before discussion, I must address my own role in this situation. All eyes turned to him. As president, I've prided myself on maintaining harmony and preserving Pinecrest's reputation at all costs. His voice carried unfamiliar emotion. What I've realized is that this approach has meant silencing legitimate concerns, burying problems rather than addressing them, and prioritizing comfort over justice. He straightened. I failed this community by allowing discrimination complaints to go uninvestigated. I failed Mr. Johnson by not ensuring everyone was informed of his arrival, and I failed Mrs. Whitfield by not addressing problematic patterns before they culminated in this incident. Karen looked up in surprise. Whatever tonight's outcome, Richard continued, I commit to leading differently, with transparency, moral courage, and genuine commitment to making Pinecrest truly inclusive, not just exclusive. For the next hour, residents came forward. Some defended Karen passionately. Others shared experiences of feeling marginalized at Pinecrest. Most powerful were voices rarely heard, the Korean family who had stopped attending pool events after being repeatedly asked if they were guests. The young black couple documented being stopped by security in their own driveway. The elderly Indian man who had withdrawn his landscaping committee application after being told his exotic ideas wouldn't fit. Karen sat motionless, hearing these stories, many for the first time, about the community she thought she knew so well. Finally, Diane approached the microphone. Karen stiffened, preparing for another betrayal from her oldest friend. I've known Karen for 15 years, Diane began, wavering slightly. We've served together, organized events together, and enforced rules together. She paused. What I need to say, what I should have said years ago, is that I watched Karen apply those rules differently depending on who was involved. And worse, I did the same myself. Karen's eyes widened in shock. It was easier to focus on people who already stood out, who seemed not quite right for Pinecrest, Diane continued, and easier to give grace to people who looked like us, who reinforced our sense of who belonged here. She turned to Karen directly. I enabled you. I nodded along when you made comments about certain people not understanding community standards. I helped create the bubble where you believed your actions were justified, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Tears welled in her eyes. I support Mr. Johnson's proposal not because it's lenient, but because it offers what we all need, a chance to build a community that actually lives up to the values we claim to hold. As Diane returned to her seat, Karen remained frozen, the full weight of the past years finally settling on her shoulders. Her identity as Pinecrest's guardian was crumbling, revealing something far more uncomfortable beneath. After all, speakers had been heard. Richard called for the vote. We will vote on two matters. First, regarding Mrs. Whitfield's position, you have three options: removal, Mr. Johnson's restorative approach, or no action. Second, we will vote on the 5 policy proposals as a package. The ballots were distributed, filled out in tense silence, and collected. As they were tabulated, the room waited with collective held breath. Finally, Richard received the tally and returned to the podium. On the matter of Mrs. Whitfield's board position, he announced, the results are: removal, 78 votes; no action, 63 votes; Mr. Johnson's restorative approach, 92 votes. A ripple of reaction moved through the room. Surprise, relief, disappointment, depending on where one sat. Therefore, Mrs. Whitfield will remain conditionally, while participating in a restorative process designed by the Diversity Committee in consultation with Mr. Johnson. Karen exhaled slowly, her emotions too complex to name. Relief mingled with humiliation, gratitude tangled with resentment. On the policy changes, Richard continued, the vote is, in favor 156, opposed 77. A cheer erupted from Amara's section, quickly contained out of respect for the divided community. The proposals are therefore adopted, Richard confirmed. Implementation will begin immediately. As the meeting concluded, the room broke into dozens of conversations. Karen remained seated, suddenly uncertain of her place in the community that had been her identity for so long. Marcus approached her quietly. "This won't be easy," he said, neither triumphant nor accusatory. "Real growth never is." Karen looked up at him, vulnerability breaking through her facade. "Why did you propose this? You could have had me removed." "Because punishment doesn't create change," Marcus replied simply. "And because public shamings rarely lead to healing or growth for individuals or communities." He offered his hand. "I don't expect us to be friends, but I do expect us to work together constructively for the community we both call home." After a moment's hesitation, Karen took his outstretched hand, a small gesture that felt momentous. Across the room, Amara and Richard conferred about next steps, their previous antagonism transformed into cautious collaboration. Trevor stood with several board members, describing security practices that needed immediate reform. The vote was over, but the real work, the harder work, of transforming Pinecrest from an exclusive enclave into a genuinely inclusive community was just beginning. As residents departed into the rainy night, the outcome felt bittersweet, a necessary disruption without a tidy resolution, a step forward that revealed how far they still had to go. For Karen, walking alone to her car, the future loomed as both threatening and potentially transformative, a place where her carefully constructed identity would need to be dismantled before something more authentic could take its place. The prospect terrified her, but for the first time she allowed herself to consider that perhaps what waited on the other side might be worth the painful journey. 6 weeks after the vote, Pinecrest's newly formed diversity committee gathered around a conference table in the clubhouse, the initial energy of victory fading into the sobering reality of implementation. Outside the windows, April sunshine bathed the golf course in golden light, but inside the atmosphere was heavy with frustration. "This is the third draft they've rejected," Amara said, rubbing her temples as she looked at the revised security protocols document. "Apparently asking guards to document their reasons for stopping residents is still too bureaucratic and undermines security's authority." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "They're using procedural objections to resist substantive change. Classic institutional resistance." Around the table sat the committee's core members, Amara and Marcus, Diane, Trevor, recently transferred to administrative duties after his whistleblowing, 2 other residents of color who had been vocal during the vote, and, most surprisingly, Karen Whitfield. Her presence, mandated by her restorative agreement, remained awkward. She participated minimally, her contributions guarded, her discomfort evident. "The problem," said Diane, glancing cautiously at Karen, "is that we're trying to change not just policies but a deeply ingrained culture. And culture fights back." Karen shifted in her seat. 6 weeks of mandatory diversity training and committee participation had left her in an unsettled state, intellectually acknowledging issues she had previously denied, emotionally resistant to their implications for her identity and status. "Perhaps," she ventured carefully, "we could approach the security revision differently. Instead of focusing on documentation requirements, which sound punitive, we could frame it as enhancing professional standards through transparency." The room fell silent, surprised by her constructive, if cautious, contribution. "That's actually helpful," Amara admitted reluctantly. "The substance stays the same, but the framing matters." Karen nodded, a flicker of her old confidence, returning. "I know how the old guard thinks. They respond to appeals to excellence and professionalism, not to what they perceive as accusations." Marcus studied her thoughtfully. Karen's journey was proving more complex than simple redemption or entrenchment. She wavered between genuine moments of insight and defensive retreats to familiar territory, making progress in fits and starts, like most genuine growth. Let's revise this section with Karen's suggestion and recirculate it, Marcus proposed. Meanwhile, we need to address the resistance to the community events calendar. Amara sighed. Gerald Thornton and his faction are calling the Diwali celebration political correctness and questioning the budget allocation. While the Easter egg hunt and Christmas gala never faced such scrutiny, Diane noted with new awareness. As the meeting continued, the committee grappled with the unglamorous reality of reform, the tedious revision of documents, the strategic navigation of resistance, the constant need to justify changes that seemed self-evidently necessary to some and radically disruptive to others. When they finally adjourned, Amara remained seated, staring at her notes, exhaustion etched in her features. The emotional labor of leading this effort had fallen disproportionately on her shoulders, as it so often did for those with marginalized identities in predominantly white spaces. You need to pace yourself, Marcus said gently, recognizing the signs of burnout he'd seen in so many activists. This is a marathon, not a sprint. I know, Amara replied, gathering her papers. But every delay, every watered-down proposal, every requirement for endless evidence and justification, it takes a toll, especially when I keep hearing that I should be grateful for the progress we've made. The gratitude tax, Marcus nodded. The expectation that we should be thankful for basic dignity and fairness. Outside in the parking lot, Karen hesitated by her car, watching Amara and Marcus emerge from the clubhouse engaged in quiet conversation. 6 weeks ago, she would have been central to any community discussion. Now she existed on the periphery, her social capital diminished, her place in Pinecrest's hierarchy fundamentally altered. Some friends had distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the controversy she represented. Others had closed ranks around her, praising her for standing up to the mob. Neither response felt satisfying. The former hurt, the latter reinforced perspectives she had begun to question. As she pulled out of the parking lot, Karen reflected on her altered reality. Her real estate firm had reinstated her license after a 4-week suspension, but clients had been scarce. Her daughter Ashley had come home for a weekend visit that was noticeably strained, their conversations carefully avoiding substantive topics. Even Diane, despite her committee participation, maintained a certain distance, their friendship forever changed by the public reckoning. The following morning, seeking normality and routine, Karen arrived at the golf course early, planning 9 quick holes before the course grew busy. As she approached the first tee, she stopped short. Marcus Johnson was there, preparing his drive. Their encounters since the vote had been limited to committee meetings, always in the formal context of group discussions. This unexpected private meeting felt different, more exposed. Marcus noticed her, nodded in acknowledgement. Mrs. Whitfield. Mr. Johnson. She hesitated, then added, I can wait for the next tea time. Not necessary, he replied, unless you'd prefer to. Or, he paused, considering something. You could join me if you'd like. I'm just getting in some practice. The invitation surprised them both. Karen wavered, poised between retreat and an opportunity she didn't fully understand. All right, she finally said, approaching cautiously. Thank you. They played the first hole in awkward silence, their discomfort a tangible presence between them. Karen was hyper-conscious of every action, every word, afraid of missteps. Marcus maintained a professional demeanor, neither overtly friendly nor cold. By the third hole, the silence had grown unbearable. Your form is excellent, Karen ventured. I can see why Richard was so eager to hire you. Thank you, Marcus replied. Then after a beat, this is strange, isn't it? The two of us here. Karen exhaled, relieved by the acknowledgement. Very strange. I keep thinking about the last time we were on this course together. Marcus lined up his shot. A lot has changed since then. Has it, though? Karen asked, surprising herself, with a candor. The committee keeps hitting roadblocks. Half the community still thinks I was right to challenge you. The other half thinks I'm irredeemable. Marcus took his swing, watching the ball arc perfectly toward the green. Change isn't linear, especially not the kind that matters. The diversity training sessions, Karen began, then faltered. They've been illuminating and uncomfortable. I keep seeing patterns I never noticed before. That's usually how it starts, Marcus replied. Seeing what was always there, but invisible to you. Karen took her turn, her drive less assured than usual. I still don't think I'm what everyone made me out to be. A racist, a monster. Labels aren't particularly helpful, Marcus said carefully. Actions and impacts matter more than what we call them. They walked together toward their balls, the conversation opening something neither had anticipated, not friendship exactly, but a tentative space for honest exchange. Can I ask you something? Karen ventured. Why did you propose that alternative at the vote? Why not just let them remove me from the board? Marcus considered the question. Because scapegoating one person doesn't change systems. And because I believed, maybe naively, that transformation is possible, even for those most invested in the status quo. And now, do you still believe that? His gaze was direct. That depends largely on you, doesn't it? The question hung between them, unanswered as they continued their game, each contemplating what genuine change might actually require of them. Across the community, in Richard Pearson's office, a different negotiation was unfolding. Gerald Thornton, flanked by 3 other longtime members, faced Richard across his desk. This has gone far enough, Richard, Thornton stated flatly. First the security protocols, now this diversity calendar nonsense. You're allowing a vocal minority to fundamentally alter what Pinecrest is. Richard maintained his composure, though inwardly he flinched at vocal minority. Precisely the kind of coded language he had become more attuned to since his own awakening. The community voted overwhelmingly to adopt these changes, Gerald. This isn't about a minority imposing their will. It's about creating a place where everyone truly belongs. Save the platitudes, Thornton cut in. We've got 4 families considering selling if this continues. People moved here for a certain atmosphere, a traditional community. They're not interested in being part of some social experiment. By traditional, you mean predominantly white and exclusive, Richard replied, surprising himself with his directness. 6 weeks ago, he would have searched for diplomatic euphemisms. Thornton's face hardened. Call it what you want. The fact is, you're risking property values and community stability for political correctness. Richard leaned forward. No, I'm finally leading with principles instead of just managing appearances. And frankly, if some members leave because they can't accept a more inclusive Pinecrest, perhaps that's ultimately for the best. The words hung in the air, a declaration that would have been unthinkable from Richard before the vote. Thornton stood, his expression cold. You've made your position clear. We'll make ours clear at the next board election. After they left, Richard sat back, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation had taken more courage than he realized he possessed. He was learning that moral leadership often meant standing alone, facing hostility from those who had once been allies. It was profoundly uncomfortable and strangely liberating. His phone rang, the gatehouse security. Sir, the Robinsons are here for their community tour. Shall I send them to your office first as requested? Richard stood, straightening his jacket. Yes, please do. The Robinson family, James, Michelle, and their 2 children, represented something important. The first black family to consider Pinecrest since the controversy. Their interest was both an opportunity and a test. When they arrived, Richard welcomed them warmly, accompanied them on a personal tour of the facilities, and introduced them to several residents, including Amara and Marcus. The tour proceeded smoothly until they reached the pool area, where several longtime residents watched with visible discomfort, exchanging whispers. One woman approached Michelle Robinson as the tour continued, speaking in what she clearly thought was a friendly manner. It's nice that you're considering Pinecrest. We've become very diverse recently. The emphasis carried unmistakable subtext. James Robinson's expression remained neutral, but his eyes met Marcus's across the pool deck, a look of weary recognition passing between them. This, too, was familiar territory. Later, as Marcus walked the Robinsons to their car, James asked quietly, "Level with me. What's it really like living here? We've heard about the incident." Marcus considered his response carefully. "It's complicated. There's genuine effort toward change, but also genuine resistance. I won't sugarcoat it. You'll experience moments like that pool conversation. But there are also committed allies working to transform this place." Michelle studied him. "Is it worth it? The emotional labor of being part of that transformation?" "That's the question I ask myself daily," Marcus admitted. "Some days the answer is yes. Some days I'm not so sure." As the Robinsons drove away, promising to consider their options carefully, Marcus wondered about his own future at Pinecrest. Was he creating meaningful change, or merely providing cover for superficial adjustments that allowed the community to feel progressive without fundamentally changing? Was investing his energy here worthwhile, or should he look elsewhere for opportunities without such burdens? At the security office, Trevor Williams cleared out his locker, having received notice of his reassignment to the night shift, a schedule change that management knew conflicted with his second job. The retaliation was subtle enough to avoid, legal issues blatant enough to send a message. "You knew this was coming," said his supervisor, not unkindly. "Whistleblowers never fare well, even when they're right." Trevor nodded, unsurprised but disappointed. "Some things matter more than job security. I can find another position. I couldn't have found another conscience." As he left the security office for the last time, Trevor realized he'd gained something valuable from the entire ordeal, a clearer understanding of how power worked in spaces like Pinecrest, and the moral clarity to choose justice over comfort when necessary. That evening, Amara sat on her patio, surrounded by committee documents, fighting exhaustion and discouragement. The initial victory had been exhilarating, but the daily grind of implementation, the resistance, the microaggressions, the constant need to justify and explain, was taking its toll. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Don't forget why we're doing this. It's not just about policies. It's about the next family who moves in, the next person who needs to be seen as fully belonging." Amara smiled faintly, appreciating the reminder. She thought of the Robinson children she'd met earlier that day. Bright, curious kids who deserved to grow up in a community that valued them fully. The work was exhausting, often thankless, but moments like that made it worthwhile. As April faded into May, subtle shifts continued throughout Pinecrest. Security began implementing the revised protocols, albeit grudgingly. The events calendar now included celebrations reflecting diverse cultural traditions, though attendance remained tentatively segregated. Committee meetings grew marginally more productive as Karen's input, while still complicated, became more consistently constructive. Yet beneath these visible changes, the real work continued invisibly in private reckonings, uncomfortable conversations, and small daily choices to see differently, to question assumptions, to extend belonging rather than guarding it. In her home office, Karen opened her email to find an invitation to the annual Pinecrest Summer Gala, traditionally the community's most exclusive and prestigious event. In previous years, she had co-chaired the planning committee. This year, her name was simply on the guest list, her role diminished, her status altered. The invitation noted that this year's gala would feature cultural elements celebrating Pinecrest's diverse community, a significant departure from tradition. Karen stared at the screen, sensing another threshold before her. Would she attend as a diminished figure in a changing community? Would old social hierarchies reassert themselves, or was something genuinely new emerging? As she considered her response, her phone rang. Diane, calling about committee business, but also perhaps reaching tentatively toward rebuilding something of their fractured friendship. Karen answered, making her choice to engage rather than retreat, to keep moving forward on the difficult path that had opened before her. A path that led not back to what had been, but toward what might yet be possible. The evening of the Pinecrest Summer Gala arrived with perfect June weather. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and lingering daylight that bathed the clubhouse grounds in golden light. Twinkling strands of lights had been strung through the oak trees surrounding the grand lawn, where elegant tables draped in white linen formed a semicircle around a wooden dance floor. A jazz quartet played softly near the bar, and catering staff in crisp uniforms circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre. From a distance, it looked like any other Pinecrest gala from years past, a carefully choreographed display of exclusivity and tradition, but the subtle differences revealed themselves upon closer inspection. The menu cards featuring dishes from diverse culinary traditions, the vibrant textile art from local cultural organizations decorating the entrance, the noticeably more varied guest list assembling on the lawn. Inside the clubhouse, Amara Washington made final adjustments to the cultural exhibit that lined the hallway leading to the grand lawn. Photographs and artifacts celebrating the rich diversity of Metro Atlanta, alongside the history of Pinecrest itself, including uncomfortable truths previously omitted from the community's official narrative. "The exhibit looks wonderful," Richard said, joining her, "though I noticed Gerald Thornton hasn't given it a single glance." Amara smiled wryly. "I didn't expect miracles, but his wife stopped to read every panel, which is something." "Progress comes in unexpected forms," Richard agreed. In the 3 months since the vote, he had grown more comfortable with the discomfort of change, less concerned with appeasing all parties, and more focused on moving deliberately toward a more inclusive community, even when the path was rocky. "The Robinsons are arriving at 8, Amara mentioned. "They signed the final paperwork yesterday. Pinecrest has its newest family." Richard's expression brightened genuinely. "That's excellent news. I was concerned after their tour experience." "They had honest questions about what they'd be walking into," Amara replied. "I didn't sugarcoat it, but I also told them about the real changes happening, the committed allies they'd find here. In the end, they decided it was worth being part of the transformation rather than waiting for it to be complete." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "A leap of faith, in a way." "Like all meaningful change," Amara agreed. She glanced at her watch. "I should check on the cultural performances. The Korean drumming ensemble goes on at 9 and they need help with setup." As Amara departed, Richard watched the guests arriving on the lawn, nodding in greeting to familiar faces while noting the newcomers, residents who had previously felt unwelcome at such formal events, now cautiously testing the waters of inclusion. The gala had always served as a microcosm of Pinecrest's social hierarchy. Tonight, that hierarchy was being gently but deliberately disrupted. Near the entrance to the grand lawn, Karen Whitfield hesitated, smoothing her navy blue dress with nervous hands. After weeks of deliberation, she had decided to attend, though the prospect filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. This event had once been her domain. She had chaired the gala committee for 5 consecutive years, dictating every detail from the menu to the music to the meticulously crafted guest list. Now she arrived as merely another attendee, her social position irrevocably altered. She had declined the committee's invitation to help plan this year's event, recognizing that her presence would create tension. Yet staying home felt too much like surrender. "You came," said Diane, appearing at her side. Their friendship had slowly begun to rebuild in recent months, though it would never be what it was, a change that Diane, at least, recognized as necessary and ultimately healthy. "I almost didn't," Karen admitted. "It feels strange being here as just a guest." "It's strange for all of us," Diane replied. "But important. Change doesn't happen if we all retreat to our corners." Karen nodded, gathering her courage, as they stepped onto the lawn together. She felt eyes turn toward her, some curious, some sympathetic, some still coldly judgmental. The universal recognition was both uncomfortable and somewhat validating. Whatever else might be said about her, Karen Whitfield was no longer invisible. Across the lawn, Marcus Johnson greeted guests alongside Richard, looking completely at ease in his perfectly tailored suit. Beside him stood a striking woman in a deep green gown, his wife, Leslie, a pediatric surgeon who had finally joined him in Pinecrest after completing her hospital contract in California. "You must be the famous Karen Whitfield," Leslie said. When introductions were made, her direct gaze neither hostile nor particularly warm. "Marcus has told me a lot about you." Karen flushed slightly. "All terrible, I imagine." "Actually, no," Leslie replied thoughtfully. "Complex, certainly. But Marcus has a rather annoying capacity for seeing multiple sides of a situation." The slight smile that accompanied this statement softened its edge. "A capacity I'm still developing," Karen acknowledged, surprising herself with the admission. The moment might have turned awkward, but they were interrupted by the arrival of Trevor Williams, not in security uniform, but in a charcoal suit, attending as a guest with his fiancée. Though he had indeed lost his position at Pinecrest after his whistleblowing, he had secured a better-paying role with a corporate security firm that valued his ethical stance. His presence at the gala as a guest rather than staff represented another small but significant boundary shift. As the evening progressed, the once rigid social groupings of Pinecrest began to dissolve and reconfigure. At Richard's deliberate suggestion, the traditional assigned seating had been replaced with open tables, encouraging new connections. Diane made a point of introducing Karen to newer residents she would have overlooked in the past, including a Pakistani-American tech executive and his wife who shared Karen's interest in garden design. Near the bar, Gerald Thornton held court with his usual contingent of longtime members, their expressions making clear their assessment of the evening's departures from tradition. When the Korean drumming ensemble began their powerful, rhythmic performance, Thornton made a dismissively loud comment about entertainment more suited to a cultural festival than Pinecrest. In past years, such a remark would have gone unchallenged or even tacitly approved. Tonight, Richard approached their table directly. "Gerald," he said pleasantly but firmly, "the Pang family who organized this performance are Pinecrest residents. Their cultural heritage enriches our community, just as everyone's does. I'd appreciate if you'd show the same respect you'd want for traditions important to you." Thornton's face reddened. "Since when did you become the political correctness police, Richard? This isn't the Pinecrest we built." "No," Richard agreed calmly. "It's the Pinecrest we're building now together. And I believe it will be stronger for its inclusivity, not weaker." He nodded politely and moved on, leaving Thornton momentarily speechless. Later in the evening, as guests mingled on the dance floor and around the dessert stations, Karen found herself momentarily alone, watching the community she had sought to protect now evolving in ways she had once feared. Surprisingly, the sky hadn't fallen. Property values remained stable. The grounds were as immaculate as ever. Yet something fundamental had shifted, not just in Pinecrest but in her. "Penny for your thoughts, Ging," said Marcus, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to her. Karen accepted with a small nod of thanks. "I was just thinking about belonging," she admitted. "What it means, who gets to define it." "Heavy thoughts for a gala," Marcus noted, though his expression was understanding rather than dismissive. 3 months ago, I would have said belonging was about fitting in, adapting to established standards. Karen continued thoughtfully. "Now I'm not so sure." "And what do you think now?" Karen considered the question seriously. "That perhaps belonging is something we create together, rather than a fixed standard some must meet while others enforce." Marcus smiled slightly. "That's quite an evolution." "Don't mistake me for a social justice warrior just yet," Karen said, a hint of her old defensiveness returning. "I still believe in standards, in tradition, in excellence," Marcus finished for her. "As do I. The question has never been whether excellence matters, but whether we recognize it can take many forms and come from many backgrounds." Karen sipped her champagne, letting the observation settle. "May I ask you something? After everything that's happened, do you feel you belong here?" "Truly?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Most days, yes. Some days, no. Belonging isn't a fixed state. It's relational, always in flux. Even for those who've never had it questioned." Before Karen could respond, They were joined by Amara and the Robinson family, making their first appearance at a Pinecrest event as official residents. Introductions were made, somewhat awkward given Karen's history, but navigated with careful civility on all sides. "We've heard a lot about you, Mrs. Whitfield," James Robinson said with diplomatic neutrality. "I imagine you have," Karen replied. Then with evident effort she added, "I hope you'll find Pinecrest to be a welcoming home. It's changing for the better." The admission clearly cost her something, but also granted her a visible sense of release. Michelle Robinson, perceiving this, responded with genuine warmth rather than the polite distance she might have maintained. "Change is rarely comfortable," she observed, "for anyone involved, but it's how we grow." As the conversation continued, Amara drew Marcus slightly aside. "The community partnerships we discussed, the mentorship program with Westlake High School, the local business initiative, the board approved both this morning. Full funding." Marcus raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Even with Thornton's opposition?" "Richard finally stopped seeking unanimous decisions," Amara explained. "He put it to a straight vote, and we had the majority. Pinecrest is going to engage with the broader community beyond our gates for the first time in its history." "That's significant," Marcus acknowledged. "Dismantling the fortress mentality is crucial." "It's just a beginning," Amara cautioned, ever aware of how much work remained. But a real one. As the evening drew to a close, the jazz quartet returned for a final set. Couples filled the dance floor while others gathered in small groups under the twinkling lights, the atmosphere notably more relaxed than at the evening's start. Karen found herself at the edge of the lawn, watching the community, her community, still though in a different way than before, in its moment of tentative transformation. She felt a complex mixture of loss and possibility, of endings and new beginnings. "Mrs. Whitfield," said Richard, joining her, "I hope the evening has been tolerable for you. I know it can't have been easy to attend." "It's been educational," Karen replied honestly, "though I'm not sure where I fit anymore." Richard nodded, understanding. "I've been asking myself the same question. The roles we built our identities around are changing. That's disorienting." "Yes," Karen agreed, grateful for the accurate naming of her experience. "But I'm beginning to think that's not entirely a bad thing." Richard smiled slightly. "Your contributions to the diversity committee have been more valuable than you perhaps realize. Your institutional knowledge, combined with your emerging willingness to question assumptions, it's an unexpectedly powerful combination." The acknowledgement touched Karen more deeply than she had anticipated. "I'm trying," she said simply. "Some days better than others." "That's all any of us can do," Richard replied. "Keep trying, keep learning, keep growing, even when it's uncomfortable, especially." Then, as the final dance ended and guests began to depart, Karen found herself face to face with Marcus once more in the parking lot. Their relationship remained complex, not friendship exactly, but a connection forged through conflict and its aftermath, through the messy, ongoing work of reconciliation without easy resolution. "Thank you," Karen said suddenly, surprising them both. "For what?" Marcus asked. "For not allowing me an easy exit," she replied after a moment's thought. "For proposing that alternative at the vote. It would have been simpler for everyone if I'd just been removed from the board, labeled the villain and pushed aside." "Simpler, maybe, but not more transformative," Marcus observed. "For you or for Pinecrest." Karen nodded. "The work has been challenging, painful often, but necessary, I think, for me at least." "For all of us," Marcus corrected gently. "None of us have arrived at some perfect enlightenment. We're all just at different points on the journey." As they prepared to go their separate ways, Karen looked back at the clubhouse, still glowing with lights, still elegant and exclusive in many ways, yet subtly, meaningfully different from what it had been just months before. "We've come some distance," she observed, "though there's still so far to go." "That's the thing about meaningful journeys," Marcus replied with a small smile. "They don't end neatly. They just continue, with new challenges, new insights, new possibilities. As Karen drove home through the manicured streets of Pinecrest, she reflected on the community she had sought so fiercely to protect. From change, from difference, from the messy reality of human diversity. She had feared that embracing inclusion would diminish what made Pinecrest special. Instead, she was beginning to glimpse how it might make the community not just more just, but ultimately richer, more vibrant, more genuinely excellent. The realization didn't erase her discomfort, her occasional defensive reactions, her moments of backsliding into old patterns of thought. Transformation wasn't a simple before and after story, but rather a continuing process of small choices, daily reckonings, and gradual evolution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult committee discussions, moments of tension, the ongoing negotiation of what belonging truly meant at Pinecrest. But tonight, driving past homes where lights still glowed in windows, Karen felt something she hadn't expected, a tentative hope that perhaps what was emerging from the painful disruption of recent months might ultimately be worth the difficulty of the journey. Not an end, but a beginning. Not a resolution, but a foundation for what might yet be built, together, in the community they all called home. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.